I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and recognise their continuing connections to the land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's the importance of connections. And by connections, I'm referring to the connections with people. The fact that we can come into contact and actually physically connect. It's interesting that we have been slowly working our way to a more online world, and there we were thrust into isolation where the online world was the only world that many of us had contact with, and we craved the connection. We realized how important the connection with real people is. Well, another connection that's really important is our connection with nature. And not just putting our feet on the ground and connecting with nature and getting out and taking the time to smell the roses and interact with fresh air and plants and birds and animals, but also our connection with light. We seem to have bypassed, we seem to have eliminated that as a factor, and actually not just eliminated it, but demonized it. We've been told to stay out of the sunlight. It causes cancer. Protect yourself. Slip, slap, slop has been the connection. And we've been warned about the dangers of UV radiation, while at the same time being told that any other radiation is perfectly safe for us. It can't harm our health. Well, I think we've got it a little bit mixed up, and today we are going to be exploring that particular connection, our connection with light, natural light and unnatural light, and the effects of it. My guest today is Dr. Leland Stillman. Leland's interest in optimal health and performance began with his own experiences and his family's as a patient, and he gives us an insight into that in his introduction. He was exposed to some of the very best and the very worst, but also the very best of conventional and complementary therapies. And so before he even entered medical school, he had already had a taste of that on a very personal level. He went on to study environmental health at Connecticut College and then received his medical degree from the University of Virginia, specializing in internal medicine. Over the course of his career, he's been fortunate enough to study with some great minds in medicine with an open mind, and his mentors have included naturopaths, acupuncturists, chiropractors, homeopaths, as well as some amazing medical doctors. In this episode, we talk about light, the effects of unnatural light from our devices in our homes, and we even talk about polar bears. I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Dr. Leland Stillman. Welcome to the show, Leland.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Leland, I'm just intrigued because you're relatively early on in your career, and yet you've had some really interesting and I would say very inspiring influences. I wondered if you might just share with us a little bit about that journey.
Sure. So you mean how I got to, my view, I guess, and philosophy of health?
Yeah.
That's a great question. It all started when my mother refused to accept the status quo in my sister's care. My sister's eyes crossed in childhood, and then she ended up getting recurrent sinus infections. And so she had to go in for ENT surgery for sinus draining. And my mother she tells this funny story about looking at the ENT doctor after the surgery is complete. And she says, "This is it, right? We never have to go through this again." My sister's in her arms, like recovering from general anesthetic, and is vomiting into an emesis basin. And the doctor says, "Oh no, the holes will probably clog up again and she'll get sinusitis again. And then we'll have to, go in and do surgery once more." And my mother thought at that moment, this cannot be the best. There has to be something better than this. And then the next 15 years and really on to now, she's worked through one practitioner after another. So we went to see, everybody under the sun. We did, cupping with some random Chinese medicine doctor in a strip mall somewhere in Virginia. I remember being taken to see craniosacral therapists and chiropractors, and we saw herbalists, and we saw Qigong healers, and we saw dowsers, and we went for astrology. I mean, we did the whole gamut. As weird and wacky as alternative medicine gets, we went there. And then we also went to, really top shelf, top of the line, conventionally trained doctors. So that was how I grew up, in this sort of in between place. And the thing that really got me to where I'm at is that I've had atrocious experiences in both worlds. And I just knew that there was so much that each had to offer. And I refused to be dogmatic about which approach we should take. I'll send people an antibiotic prescription, and I'll refer to a surgeon, and we'll do injections, and we'll draw blood, and we'll check labs. And if we can do something with an herb that we can do with the drug, we'll do that. And if they need a manipulative therapy like massage or chiropractic or osteopathic or craniosacral therapy or whatever, we'll do that too. So it's all about finding the right tool for the patient and considering their unique context, their case, and also in some cases their sensibilities, because they're the ones who have to live with the consequences of what you recommend. And I've been amazed by the resiliency of patients. Like a cookie cutter approach to me just becomes more and more ridiculous as I get older and older, which is why I just, the more I practice, the more I sort of laugh at people who worry about guidelines and, expert opinions and what the committees and the experts think. I mean, those guys have no idea how to actually get patients better. So that's how I got to where I'm at. Very interested in outcomes, very interested in results for my patients. And I refuse to settle for a lot of the dysfunctionality that people take for granted as just their doom or destiny.
Which is an interesting way of entering med school, isn't it? Having been exposed to all of that and then going to the creme de la creme, of the top of the healthcare tree, supposedly.
Right.
You go to med school, and given that exposure, med school takes on quite a different context, doesn't it? How did you find your medical education?
If I had to sum up modern medical education in one word, it would be farcical, because you're charging the government and patients enormous amounts of money to do things that are largely unnecessary. What I mean by that is this: 99% of people who are hospitalized anywhere in the world right now for anything are doing a lot of obviously bad things all day, and they don't seem to care. A lot of them don't understand that they're harmful for them. And I can just tell one story after another. A lot of what I do with patients is make sure that they're dotting the I's and crossing the T's, sometimes on basic stuff. For example, somebody came to me once with very severe sneezing fits that were impairing their ability to work. One of the things I urge them to do is check their home's ventilation system. And she swore up and down, no, there's no problems. We have it inspected, blah, blah, blah. Well, lo and behold, 2 or 3 months later, we get these allergy tests back, and she's got this raging allergy to a fungus mold that's a common component of water damage in buildings. And I say, hey, look, are you sure there's no water damage in your building? And she comes back to me and she says, as a matter of fact, there's a lot of water damage on the underside of the house. And she remediated it, and her symptoms went away. Now, I cannot tell you how many doctors I've shadowed in the world of allergy, pulmonology, ENT, who don't actually hold their patients' feet to the fire and get them to actually figure that out. Because guess what? So long as they check all the boxes for the insurance companies, so long as they submit all the right paperwork, so long as they follow all the rules and follow all the guidelines, their payment is exactly the same. And that is not how I work. I work on retainer, which means that if I get somebody such good results that they don't have any more questions and they're busy leading their life, I get to go out and play another game of tennis. And if I haven't gotten them better, I get to spend another 30 minutes on the phone with them trying to figure out what I'm missing. And darned if it isn't those little things. Oh, now you tell me your HVAC system has mold in it. Oh, now you tell me you're drinking tap water. Oh, now you tell me, you're still eating Cheetos and Ho-Hos and Triscuits at 11 o'clock at night on a Friday. So that's a lot of healthcare, and it's creating this epidemic of disease Now, the reality is doctors and scientists are totally focused on the wrong metrics, the wrong interventions, because of basically how the pharmaceutical industry has corrupted the practice of medicine away from its foundations. And part of my journey as a doctor was, or a big part, I would say, is really coming home to ideals that have always been the convention in medicine. We talk about conventional medicine and people think, oh, hospitals, doctors, drugs, surgeries. No. The convention, if you think of it as starting with the founder and father of Western medicine, who canonically is considered to be Hippocrates, he said the greatest medicine of all is teaching people how not to need it, which means his goal was to get his patients off of medications, which is my goal. I don't use supplements forever. I don't tell people to come back in for another injection every month for the rest of their life. I want to figure it out. I want to put the problem to rest. And I want them to come back and tell me about how great their year was, next year for an annual physical. That's what I want to do because it's so much fun.
Yeah.
And so, I just kept going through that. And the more I read about the history of medicine and also reading the great works of past doctors like Osler and Hippocrates, and Paracelsus, they have these ideas about you should fix the patient's environment, fix their diet, fix their lifestyle, and they'll get better. And then you won't have to resort to all this heroic medicine where you're giving people massive doses of whatever, or you're taking them in for very invasive surgeries, and you're really not getting them better. You're just sort of managing disease one day at a time.
Yeah, well, this is music to our ears, Leland, because, I've often said that our current healthcare system is actually a chronic disease management system, which is a great economic model. There's no question about that. It's generating billions of dollars, in fact, trillions of dollars. The only problem with it is it's not a great health model. So to hear, and I know your background initially was through environmental medicine, which is also, your example there of the mold is a classic one, because people could be on the best of diets, taking the best of supplements and meditating to the nth degree. But if their house is full of mold, we're behind the eight ball right away. But when we talk about environmental medicine, there is one aspect of it, which I'm looking forward to talking to you about. And that is that wonderful thing that happens every day as the sun rises above the horizon and then sets behind us or wherever. That's a really important part of our day for many reasons. And that's been an important part of your approach to healthcare. Tell us a little bit about how you came to look at light as shaping life, that concept of light as shaping life.
Yeah, absolutely. So light shaping life is not a phrase of my own invention. It's a book by a guy named Roland van Wyk, I think he's Dutch or Danish. And I heard about that book through Dr. Jack Kruse, who's a neurosurgeon, who is the person who introduced me to the concept of light as a therapeutic and also as a poison, because if something can be a medicine, it can be a poison, as my mentor, Dr. Beck, likes to say. So I got introduced to that because I was working at this very intense wellness clinic in Florida where people would fly in and be treated for weeks or months or even years for complex chronic illness. And I was very frustrated by the fact that some of these patients were not getting better despite all of the extreme things that we were recommending to them. And, I had joined up because I saw amazing results, and people do get amazing results doing extreme things. But, the thing that really bothers me about a lot of therapeutics is, and this is so funny, I was just listening to the radio today and I heard about this study coming out of the University of Chicago where they found out that, or they're hypothesizing, and their initial study results suggest that small doses of laughing gas may be effective at treating depression. Well, no kidding, right? You're altering respiratory mechanics in the body using a volatile gas that has properties as an immunomodulator and a neurotransmitter. And, did you know that all those pathways are affected by things in the environment like light or the sinonasal microbiome or blood flow into the sinuses, which are affected by things like your diet? Do you have a normal arginine level? Are you transforming, nitrogen-based amino acids in the proper way? Are you getting sunlight on your skin that will induce the production of endothelial nitric oxide? And I'm thinking to myself, this is yet another example of academics coming in with a very expensive procedure-based solution in an office seemingly in total ignorance of all the natural mechanisms that life has to modulate itself and these different pathways. So anyway, I got interested in light because a patient brought it to my attention and said, look, we're doing very extreme things here, and we all think that's great. We're all on board with that. Eyes wide open, adult patients, consenting adults. But there's other stuff out there that we don't know about and that we're not doing in this clinic. And I just followed up on it. And man, what a deep rabbit hole to fall down, because there's hundreds of years of research on light therapy. And it even goes back to the ancient Greeks. The Oath of Hippocrates starts with the line, I swear by Apollo the healer. Apollo, the god of the sun, is the healer. And, darned if my patients aren't very clear with me that their illnesses are worse in winter and better in summer. There are caveats to that. There's some that are the opposite. And we can talk about why that is, because it's a really fascinating point that gets into virology, which is a hot button topic right now. Yes. But yeah, I fell down that rabbit hole and just wanted to know everything about how light was shaping life, because the more I read, the more it made sense of things I'd seen for years and couldn't make sense of. I cannot tell you how many people I've met over the years who eat a pristine, careful, organic, grass-fed, non-GMO, free trade, gluten-free, soy-free, dairy-free, blessed by the Dalai Lama diet, and they're not healthy. And they're just scratching their head, how can I not feel well despite having eaten an organic acai bowl with Brazil nuts for breakfast and a gluten-free spinach wrap for lunch and a free-range chicken breast with roasted vegetables for dinner? And the answer is not, try another diet. Because a lot of them will tell you, hey, listen, they're coming to me because it's easy to try new diets. And you just Google different fad diets and you get 20 different options. And they're coming to me because they're like, look, I've already tried carnivore. I've already tried paleo. I've already tried this. I've already tried that. Or I'm on this diet and it's everything I think I know how to eat. And I've got to expand my template because I'm losing my mind. What can I do to fix my gut so that I can tolerate food again and be a normal person? That's the kind of consult I get.
And light being part, that missing link, because after you've identified all of those terrific nutritionals and you've sorted out their environment through the mold and the house, the missing link is this light. Tell us about what light therapy is.
Yeah, so light therapy is, any light administration that will build health, resiliency, or reverse disease. And in order to get into light therapeutics, you first have to ask the question, well, what effects does light exert on life? This is basically broken down pretty easily through the different portions of the electromagnetic spectrum. So the radio and microwave radiations nature never uses, which I find remarkable. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not cell phones, Wi-Fi routers, Bluetooth, smart this, smart that is harmful to people. And my question to people who think that it's totally harmless is simply this. If life can create every frequency of light up to ultraviolet type C light, why doesn't it use radio and microwave radiation? It can make everything else, and you're telling me it just decided to avoid radio and microwave radiation because what? It was too easy to make it because it's lower energy. It's less energy intensive. The fact that life uses UVC light in order to signal cell division is amazing. What's even more amazing than that is that most doctors and scientists have absolutely no idea that that's true. And they think it's some kind of wacky hocus pocus just because they're too busy doing whatever it is they're doing to go out and bother to read the research papers by guys like Fritz Popp. So generally speaking, light therapeutics come down into, in my mind, like three different options. This is very broadly speaking. And it excludes many medical devices like PEMF devices or radio frequency ablation for things like hyperhidrosis and all kinds of stuff that I don't actually know very much about, frankly. But you have red and infrared light. Red and infrared light help to build the exclusion zone of water in the cell, a la Gilbert Ling, a la Gerald Pollack. There are these interesting theories about how energy is generated in the cell using light rather than using chemical energy substrates like ATP, which again are in the blind spot of almost everybody in cell and molecular biology. And there are also some really interesting effects that those frequencies have, and this is part and parcel of how they work. on enzyme mechanics in your cells. The best paper I've seen on that, most interesting anyway, is one that had they dosed mice with a toxin, and this is in Fritz Holwich's book, The Influence of Ocular Light Perception on Metabolism in Man and Animal, and it's published in 1979. They did a study where they exposed two different groups of mice to the same toxin at the same dose, and they had different lethal effects or different toxic effects based on the light the animals were under, which should imply that anyone who's being admitted to the hospital with an acute poisoning event should be kept under a very strict light regimen, which they're not, because nobody in modern academic medicine knows anything about this research. Red and infrared, very healing, help with energetic production in the cell. Bright light therapy, which most people know as SAD light or seasonal affective disorder lights. I don't know how much of that is happening in Australia because you guys are so close to the equator. But here in the United States or anywhere in a high latitude, you have a light deficiency syndrome in the winter, which is called seasonal affective disorder. But it's really the predictable consequence of people living in a dim world. The brighter the light that's hitting your eye and the more intensity there is, basically a visible light, the higher your production of hormones and neurotransmitters is going to be. This translates into changes in mood. It translates into changes in signaling pathways that affect certain diseases of the skin, autoimmune diseases like melasma, psoriasis, eczema, acne. All of these things can be modulated by the amount of visible light in the environment. And this is one reason why people will clearly tell you that their skin illnesses vary from summer to winter. The other thing that they've been told that the reason for this is actually vitamin D. Saying that vitamin D is the reason that the sun is healthy is a little bit like saying that magnesium is the reason why eating plants is good for you. It's a very simplistic approach to a very complex thing. That's the last piece of light therapeutics for me, is ultraviolet light. UVA and UVB light both have different effects on human biology. UVA induces the production of melanocyte stimulating hormone and has a whole cascade of effects on metabolism, energy production, hormones, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things you'll see in the chronic Lyme mold world, and I want to be clear, I don't necessarily agree with the premise of those diagnoses, but that world they're very obsessed with, they're very interested in alpha melanocyte stimulating hormones being low. There is a correlation between people who have low alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone and being sick or chronically ill. Those people also tend to be indoor people. Some of them, it's because they can't stand the light. It's very intense and they have photophobia or they get sunburned very easily, but that's all linked to other problems. Then UVB light is what produces vitamin D in the skin, which has a whole host of signaling cascade effects. And, obviously all of this is so pertinent right now or relevant right now because all of the diseases that we're seeing in modernity that have set people up, for premature death, disability, and vulnerability to infectious diseases, whether it's, a flesh-eating bacteria that comes out of nowhere or, an opportunistic GI pathogen or, a virus of some nature, all of these things come back to, and their rise has really been predicated or it's been coincidental with our move from the outdoor environment to the indoor environment, from a brightly, naturally lit environment to a artificially lit, dim indoor environment.
Of which putting people in lockdown doesn't actually help that very much. And another public health message to stay out of the sun to protect yourself from cancer is ironic, to say the very least.
Yes.
I mean, our relation, we've actually been, the sun has been demonized and its effect has been quite dramatic. Tell us a little bit about some of the diseases that are actually affected positively by our exposure to those lights.
It's funny you should mention that. There are very few diseases that are not, that do not respond to therapeutic doses of sunlight. And the reason I say it that way is that if I say the sun cures all these diseases, that's too simplistic. If you misbehave enough, you can manifest any disease. But the sun, generally speaking, helps mitigate a huge proportion of the illness that we see in modern life. And also in the ancient world. I mean, that's why it was, I swear by Apollo the healer, not, I swear by the god of winter. That'd be the opposite. Hades and death has always been associated with darkness and a lack of light. And so the effects of light on our systems is so complex. It really defies anyone's ability to summarize. But the data is so clear that the benefits of sun exposure, prudent sun exposure, are vastly outweighed by the dangers of the benefits of sun exposure are outweighed relative to the risk of skin cancer. And so, we see this in things like the melanoma in southern Sweden trial, which is sort of the flagship study of this whole, the sun is good for you, shall we say, meme. They saw that the risk of death in the people who avoided the sun the most was the same as the people who didn't avoid the sun at all, but smoked the most. So it's equivalent as a risk factor for all-cause mortality as smoking. And all the other papers I've looked at on this, and there are many, show that there is a mortality benefit or decrease with sun exposure, and that it outweighs the risk of skin cancer. When you look at the numbers, it's very clear. And it also you have to remember, right? 12,000 people or so in the United States, it's slightly less than that, die every year of skin cancer. Well, last year was something like 3.4 million people died. You do the math, it's a very low % chance of skin cancer. And so the dermatologist will say, yeah, I know, but I see a lot of skin cancer and I want to prevent it. And I say, yeah, I know. But for every case of skin cancer you may prevent, there may be a patient showing up in the hospital with an advanced solid, internal tumor malignancy that's metastatic that we didn't catch because it's not on the skin. It's very easy to catch a skin cancer compared to, say, a colon cancer, compared to a breast cancer, compared to a stomach cancer, any other kind of solid organ malignancy. And so the idea that, I joke with people that if the sun causes cancer, then spoons make people fat. It's a very simple way of looking at it. We are not simple systems. You have to have a complex, nuanced view of this, or you're going to make big mistakes like thinking that just because you wear sunscreen, you're not going to get skin cancer. The data is not clear on that. What kind of sunscreen? When? For how long? How much sun exposure did you get without sunscreen? Was your vitamin D normal? What did you eat? Did it provide you the vitamin D that maybe you didn't get from the sun? All these factors play a role in whether or not the patient gets sick, stays sick, or gets better.
I mean, we know intuitively that being out in the sun makes us feel better. I think most people do feel that. Isn't it wonderful to be out in the sun? Is great.
Exactly.
But to tell us a little bit about why that sun is so good for us. What's actually going on?
Sure. So starting with the red and infrared portions of the spectrum, right? That energy is being used by your body to expand its exclusion zone to increase cellular energy generation. This is one reason why people so often say that they feel more energy during the summer months and when they've spent a certain amount of time outside. It's also why we'll see increases in actual energy production in people who are treating with photobiomodulation, that's red or infrared light therapy. Second effect comes from the effect of visible light. Every visible light photon that your body absorbs essentially is sending a signal to your body that it is daytime, and it exerts an effect that increases your levels of hormones and neurotransmitters. And those have a very powerful cascade of effects on your biology. And to make a long story short, you want strong circadian rhythms, which is what bright light really fuels. And you want these big peaks of neurotransmitter and hormone production. And then you want these, deep nadirs. You want to have a really big diurnal rhythm to your hormones and neurotransmitters. That's blunted in a lot of diseases, and it's blunted with aging. And you can blunt it, by living in a dimly lit environment and then being exposed to lots of light at night, because you're basically screwing up your body's whole perception of the day-night cycle. Now, over time, that compounds into, because what's happening with these circadian rhythms is really that at night, the body is taking out the trash. And if the body is constantly on, it says, oh, well, we got to keep going. Because if you have a life or death situation at night that's keeping you awake, your body doesn't second guess you. It says, okay, well, we're going to take out the trash tomorrow night. That's why you'll have this rebound sleep effect. If you sleep deprived for a couple of days, nights, weeks, whatever, you'll have a catch-up effect. We'll have some nights where you want to get 10, 11 hours, maybe have an afternoon nap, right? Your body is trying to catch up for, burning the candle at both ends for a certain amount of time. So you want to have, and in nature, really all these things are yoked. And when I say yoked, what I mean is they're linked and they're equal. So everywhere you've got a very long day during the summer, you have an equally long night during the winter. And so you must assume, right, that during the winter, these organisms, people living in these cold places, they have more time to regenerate and rejuvenate and get better. And when you deprive people of that time by giving them artificial light that allows them to stay up virtually forever, right, you're just delaying taking out the trash to the point that the body can no longer cope. And this is why things like Alzheimer's disease have only been discovered, post the invention of artificial light. There's a lot of other sort of factors in that illness, and we could talk for a long time about that. But, it's one of those things. People who are exposed to excessive artificial light at night have more cognitive decline. That's why one of the reasons why I think I have this right. I think Dale Brett is in the big Alzheimer's researcher. He's got light and sleep certainly in his protocol, because it's obvious that, inefficient sleep, poor sleep leads to dementia. So you need that bright light. That's what keeps your circadian rhythms on point, and it helps your body to rest and regenerate at night and then be active during the day. And then you need UV light because it has all these effects on really a lot of different hormone and neurotransmitter systems. Your endorphins are modulated by this. Your endocannabinoid system is modulated by this. Your sex steroid hormones are modulated by UV light. Vitamin D is created by UV light. All these things are vital to health and wellness. So when you're chronically depriving yourself of ultraviolet light, what you're really doing is hamstringing your normal native biology that relies on it and is used to having it in a state of nature that we've really interfered with, modern buildings and windows and so on and so forth.
It's not just our lack of exposure to sunlight, but it's what we do to almost to challenge it even more with, what we're doing right now. You and I are sitting in front of our computer screens. We have LED lights, we have our lighthouse, and the impact of that is a double whammy, if you like, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. People don't realize, how the frequencies of light are balanced in nature and very imbalanced in a lot of lighting. And my favorite paper on this is Melatonin and the Optics of the Human Body by Scott Zimmerman, and I can't remember the other guy's name, but it's a great paper. 2019, I think, was the year they published it. And they really give people a great breakdown of how visible only lighting is a hazard, modern health hazard. And so for people who don't know, like incandescent lighting, the original artificial fake man-made light was with a filament, and the electricity flowed through it and heated it up, and then heated up to such a degree that it created light. And if you are familiar with metallurgy, you know that when you heat up a piece of metal, first it radiates heat, you feel the heat, that's infrared light. Then it turns red, then it turns yellow, then it turns orange, then it turns white hot. And with lighting, we started out with only the ability to produce visible light when we had a significant proportion of light accompanying it that was in the red and the infrared spectrum. When you look at the solar spectrum, or the spectrum of light that's emitted by the sun, it's very heavy in the red and infrared light wavelengths. And so our bodies are adapted to that. And this is why red and infrared light therapy are so powerful therapeutically. And it's also why they're being investigated now more than ever for the treatment of ocular diseases like, say, macular degeneration or premature the presbyopia, the aging of the eye, really. When you eliminate that light, which has this powerful effect on energy generation and cellular metabolism, and you're only submitting the cell to visible only light. Visible only light has it's actually a stress on the cell, and it can destroy many of the biomolecules that we depend upon for our health. Now, it's not so much that you want to avoid blue and green light, because it does have positive effects on your biology, but out of the proper context, it really becomes a liability. And in nature, it's always balanced by this red and infrared light that have this sort of healing effect right alongside the stress of green and blue light, which is one reason why we think now that, and like I said, visible only lighting is a health hazard, and really the healthiest lighting for people is actually going to be incandescent lighting. And that's what I have in my office. people's LED lights, if they don't produce any heat, they don't produce any infrared light. And so people are constantly exposing themselves to these very high intensity visible light only photons, which are associated with premature aging and disease. And so that's why I use incandescent bulbs. It's why I get sun exposure. It's why I maximize the amount of sunlight that comes into my office. And that's another reason. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I actually don't wear sunglasses, is I want to be getting natural light into my eye.
And you mentioned that great paper by Zimmerman on melatonin. Just to remind us about, there's a book I know called Melatonin, the Master Hormone, and it's about 400 or 500 pages long. So there's a lot more to it than just giving us a good night's sleep.
Right.
Tell us a bit more about melatonin.
Yes, it's the master hormone. And the paper that really brought this home for me in terms of its clinical impact was this case that was reported in the New England Journal of Medicine in the 1980s of this young man who they weren't sure why he had this, but he had a lack of testosterone. He wasn't developing normally. He was a teenager. He was clearly a late bloomer. His parents and he became concerned. They wanted him to have a normal life. They wanted him to go through puberty. And when they tested this kid's melatonin level, it was sky high. And what they did was they treated him with testosterone agonists or testosterone. And he ended up going through puberty. And then years later, he was able to stop testosterone. But the theory that they advanced in this paper is, this kid had something weird that was causing him to have super high levels of melatonin. This resulted in a suppression of his gonadal axis and a lack of puberty, or a delay in the onset of puberty. And when you look at melatonin's effects on all the other hormones, it's far from straightforward, but it's very clear that it's an extremely complicated dance. It has effect on all the other hormones. I've read a lot of papers on this, and I can't give you a clear answer because it isn't simple. It's not like, if you suppress melatonin, you'll have low progesterone. If you suppress melatonin, you'll have high estrogen. Or if you suppress melatonin, you'll have, high testosterone. It's not that simple because there's many other factors. But what it does is it really entrains our circadian rhythms, and it brings our organ systems into alignment in their circadian rhythms. That's important because let's say that you eat a lot at night. You're sending your gut a circadian signal that it's the day. If your light that you're being exposed to in your eye has a different circadian rhythm, we might hypothesize then that your gut is not going to be on the same schedule as the rest of your body. Well, if that's happening, then might we see an increased rate of disease in that organ system relative to other people who don't do that thing at night? And indeed we do. We see a lot of abnormal labs and a lot of abnormal physiology and disease in people who eat at night, or who are active at night, who work the night shift, who are exposed to artificial light at night. So melatonin is really the signaling molecule that mediates all of these effects of light. And I shouldn't say all of them, but many of them. And really it's where people need to realize you can talk about melatonin, you can talk about light, but it's a little bit like talking about, the tires in the road. They are interacting. And, you're not talking about a car driving on a road without talking about tires, without talking about the road. They are so closely linked. And to talk about one without the other is really almost purposeless. And every statement that I've made in this podcast so far about light, we could talk about the biomolecules that really signal those effects and those changes, because it's all being mediated by actual, biological or biomolecules, matter.
Another thing that people have become very aware of is the microbiome. And they often think, well, I need more fiber, I need to change my diet, I need fermented foods, etc., etc. But the light also has an impact on microbiome. I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about that.
Right. And so this is an interesting and emerging area of the research, because it's very hard to isolate these variables. But there is evidence that if you illuminate people with certain light, you're going to change their microbiome. And if you look at someone's metabolism as just as much being about the light they're emitting as the fuel they're burning, vis-a-vis somebody who's burning more energy is making more light in their mitochondria. because every one of these biochemical reactions where you're combusting a substrate, whether it's a fatty acid or an amino acid or a carbohydrate, is releasing some kind of light energy. So when you change someone's metabolism, you aren't just changing their biochemistry, you're changing them biophotonically. That kind of blows people's minds, but it's true. So what did you ask me?
About the microbiome and how light. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you change the light someone's living under, you can have an effect on their microbiome. And it's very difficult to say what this is due to, right? Because if you're giving someone, say, a dose of UVB light that changes their microbiome because of an effect on their immune system, well, then you affected it through their immune system. But let's say that you increased the amount of time they have at night to recharge the battery in darkness. Well, maybe what you did was you increased their melatonin levels, and this had another effect on their immune system. And maybe you changed their eating habits. So they're eating suddenly in a time restricted window because they're getting less light and it's making them less hungry and they're less active and they're going to bed earlier, or they're sleeping through the night because their cortisol is better modulated. And all of a sudden they're not feeding the bugs with the sugars that they used to be eating at 11 o'clock at night. I mean, many patients come to me having GI issues because when they eat certain foods, and it's not necessarily that they're allergic to the food, it's that they're eating a food that is fueling a microbial population that is overgrown. And when they fast, they feel better because that microbial population is quiescent, is not active. You treat them with an antibiotic, an antifungal, or antiparasitic, you knock that out, all of a sudden they can tolerate that food again. So, and what's funny about treating people with antibiotics is what you're really doing is you're inhibiting the ability of the bacteria, the yeast, the fungi to metabolize things, which then causes them to die because their metabolism is broken and they can no longer transform biomolecules, but they can also no longer be photonically active, so to speak.
I mean, I think the other thing about the impact of light and the seasons is that if we are eating seasonally, that is what we've evolved to do over our entire human journey, apart from this more recent time where we have foods available to us 24/7, 52 weeks of the year. There's no seasonality has gone out of the window as well, hasn't it?
Right. And I like to joke, and it's true, but I joke about it because I don't know what to do but laugh about it. It's so sort of tragically funny, right? We're the only animal on planet Earth that's smart enough to eat a non-local, non-seasonal diet and dumb enough to argue about what we should eat.
Yeah. Yes.
Everything else on planet Earth is like, oh, there's food over there, I'm going to go eat it. And it's really interesting to talk to biologists about this because they'll actually tell you, people have these cute ideas about, oh, the deer, there's cute little vegetarians. No. If a deer wanders across a baby bird nest, the ground nesting bird, and they realize there's an egg there, they'll eat it. Animals will eat anything. And, the more of a scavenger they are, the less picky they are about their meat, right? Our closest cousins or relatives, taxonomically speaking, are pigs and bears.
Yes. Okay.
You can draw analogies to, say, lions and tigers. I know it's very much in vogue with the carnivore thing. But we're really closer in our digestion to these other omnivores. And it's interesting because they don't think about what to eat. And, there's not an epidemic of COVID in the bear population or in the pig population. And when you do find illnesses in these animals, like there's this weird, I haven't read up on this in more than a decade, but there's this weird fungal, or I think it's like some weird viral disease of the Tasmanian devils. Am I wrong?
Oh yeah, look, don't put me on the spot there, Leland, but yeah, it's possible. It's quite possible. But I know that you are very keen, you're drawing these analogies with bears and in particular polar bears. Polar bears are, have taught you an important lesson. And I wondered if you might share that with us.
Right. So yeah. Polar bears are one of my favorite teaching cases because they really illustrate how life has to cope with extreme light environments. And, people who don't appreciate the power of light in their own life because they've never really thought about it, you sort of point out to them how dependent life is on light in high latitudes, they begin to appreciate what it can do to them, no matter their latitude. And polar bears are one of our closer cousins, and they're the furthest north dwelling of all the bears. They also technically live on the sea ice much of the year. And they live in such a cold place that if they mistime things like reproduction or leaving the den, or if they make mistakes in where they build their den in the winter, it's a lethal mistake. It's a lethal error. Their cubs may freeze to death or may starve to death, which is sort of if you're freezing to death in a very cold place, there's a good chance you're starving, because otherwise your body would increase its metabolism to burn energy or burn fuel or food, I guess, for heat, right? And so everything about polar bear physiology is optimized in order to take advantage of seasons of abundance, the summer, and then burn off all that fat in the winter in their dens when it's extremely cold. And we see seasonal variations in the microbiomes of the bears because what they're eating is changing radically. And we see changes in their metabolism happening with this as well. And the sort of chicken or the egg question is the bear's metabolism changing because of the light, or is the bear's metabolism changing because of what it's eating? And this is something that academics may argue about until the end of time. I just know that my patients get really sick when they eat a lot of food at night and never really rest in the absence of, excessive blue and green light. And the way the polar bear physiology is put together is just an absolutely amazing phenomenon of how they're wired into their environment to do really extreme things like gain their body weight over, 100, something like they gain 100% of their body mass. So they double their weight and then they drop it back, obviously, in the winter. I mean, imagine doing that in a season. It's an incredible metabolic feat. And they're obviously very carefully adapted to it. But it just goes to show you how much what you eat and the light you're living under can affect your biology, because the same pathways that were present in the polar bear are present in us.
So what lessons do you learn from that analogy, from that, the study of polar bears, and what can we take from it as humans?
Yeah, so people who live in ignorance of the therapeutic and toxic effects of light are going to have diseases that frustrate their physicians and plague them and gradually get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And the minute you start turning light into a therapy, you begin to see amazing results, in yourself, in patients. In my own health, I saw a tremendous benefit from blue blockers. I went from being a very sleep deprived medical resident or trainee to being somebody who could finally sleep through the night again. It didn't happen without fixing my light environment. And it's happened for patient after patient. I've had patients who had weird ocular diseases that their ophthalmologists and optometrists just told them they were going to be doomed to suffer from for the rest of their lives disappear overnight when they just fixed their lighting environment, because nobody had brought it up to them.
Well, you mentioned blue blockers, and I think we were talking about this before we came on. I've got my glasses there. Tell us a little bit, for the person who's not familiar, familiar with it. Tell us what the blue blocker is and how we can use it.
Yeah, so blue blockers are glasses that block blue light, and they are very effective for a variety of issues. But the number one thing people need to know about them is that they are appropriate in a setting in which the blue light in the lighting you're being exposed to is excessive. So office workers who can't change the color temperature of their screen, people who have to work late at night, doctors, nurses, whoever, they may begin to experience stress headaches. They may begin to experience brain fog, fatigue, simple just eye strain, the sense that your eyes are tired. All of that can be mitigated by wearing blue blockers. The tint is the main point that I think patients are confused about, which is simply that the weaker blue blockers only block 10 to 15% of the blue light. The stronger ones are a dark red, orange, or amber color, and they're going to block somewhere between 80 to 99% of the light. I want patients to wear those dark red blue blockers after dark and before dawn. If they're trying to reverse a chronic disease, I want them to be religious about it. the sicker they are, the more they need them. And I want them to also be living in an environment and working preferably in an environment where they're not being exposed to extremely high color temperature, extremely bright blue light, especially bright light that doesn't have any kind of incandescent balancing it out.
So, I mean, computers is one exposure. LED lights, which are almost ubiquitous in modern homes, is another one. So you would say these orange tinted blue blockers would go on from sundown, as soon as the sun goes down and you're turning on lights, or if you happen to be sitting in front of a TV or a computer or a tablet or a phone or a laptop, you would be wearing these glasses.
That's right. But the caveat is that a lot of screens you can modulate the color temperature on.
Yeah.
And for people who don't know what color temperature is, I used the analogy earlier of metallurgy in terms of the intensity or the brightness of a light. And that's where color temperature comes from. The lower the color temperature, the warmer and less blue and green light there is in the light. The higher the color temperature, the more blue and green light there is in it. So the sun at noon in the summer is something like 6,000 Kelvin. And a candlelit dinner is something like 1900 Kelvin. So after dark, I like something that's, 1900, 2000 Kelvin, or a zero blue light LED bulb that's not going to disrupt my circadian rhythms. And then if I'm dealing with a screen that I can't modulate, I will wear my dark red blue blockers to do it for me.
And these other ones, I've got the other set, which are less, they're the ones that only give you the 10 to 15% filter. Is that the...
Right. I still recommend those to people who can't change the color of their screen because it's, say, a work computer, or to people who are working during the day, because it will blunt some of the negative effects of the blue light. By no means is it a total panacea. What I think is more important for those people is to keep the screen at a dim setting, so it's not the dominant light that's hitting their eye, and then to make sure they have plenty of sunlight and natural light coming into their office, because that natural light is going to help maintain a normal, healthy globe and then brain behind it, globing in the globe of the eye.
And when it comes to sunlight, I mean, putting aside, let's accept that burning one's skin is not a good thing, but there are many shades of grey between that. How do you recommend people interact with sun?
So I recommend that people focus on getting natural light in their life at all times of day without burning. And what that looks like, generally speaking, for my patients is I want you to get outside sometime in the morning for 20 minutes, an hour, whatever you can manage. Even if you're somebody who gets up and goes to work before it's light out, if you can get out between, sun up and midday, that's actually still important to me. Then I want people getting outside in the middle of the day, and I want them exposing some kind of skin to the brightest light that they're under. I want their exposure to be less than causing a burn, and they've got to be properly nourished. Otherwise, they're not going to respond well to it. Then I want some kind of natural light exposure later in the day. And then after dark, I want people to mimic nature in the sense that blue and green light are usually gone after dark in nature. And that's how it really ought to be inside of our homes and offices at that time as well. There are exceptions to this, like you can't expect airline pilots to fly without blue and green light. I wouldn't want them to. You also have people like doctors and nurses making important decisions who need to be fully awake for them, right? So I have no problem with, artificial light in, what was my working environment, the hospital, because you just can't operate without it. So that's what people need to know. You really want a naturalistic lighting environment, and you need to get a certain amount of UV light in your life. Otherwise, you'll never have a normal vitamin D level, not to mention all the other effects of UV light. And that is very clearly a recipe for premature death and disability.
And then light therapy. Now, I just showed you before we came on that as I reach across my desk, I've got my infrared lamp sitting here on my desk. But tell us about how light therapy can be used.
So light therapy is something that I work with people to come up with tailored protocols for, depending on their situation. But generally speaking, I want people to have a red and infrared light therapy panel somewhere in their life. Generally speaking, what I'm telling them to do is get a bigger panel and hang it somewhere in their home where they're going to be able to go straight from the shower to the light therapy panel and get 5, 10, 20 minutes in front of it every day. Because the more skin area you have exposed, the greater the effect. And the logical time to do it is right after you've showered, for example, in the morning. It's a great way to start the day.
Mm. And how long would you be exposed to that? What you said?
Yeah, so it really varies on the patient. I've yet to have anybody overdose on red light. In fact, if anything, my patients have been so enthusiastic about it, they'll come back and they'll say, yeah, I spent another $1,000 on red light therapy devices this month because the one I already have has had such a profound effect on my life. So there's no, I've never had anyone tell me they overdosed.
Now, listen, one thing I wanted to ask you about also was COVID. I mean, we're on a global journey here, aren't we? And
right.
And I actually see it as a wonderful opportunity with people never focused on health like never before. Mm-hmm. How are you seeing it? How are you seeing the way it's being managed and being managed?
Well, I certainly think the sad thing is that a lot of people are advancing their nefarious agendas on the back of the suffering of others. The agenda to consolidate power in political institutions, in academic medical institutions, and this agenda to sideline anything that is natural, holistic, preventative in nature that is not a profitable enterprise or paradigm for these big institutional players. They would come back and say that I'm a hopeless crank who doesn't appreciate the magnitude of the data that they have accrued and generated for their interventions, to which I would respond, they haven't taken the time to study natural medicine the way it deserves to be studied. And that's obviously because it's not going to make anybody the money that, say, pharmaceutical sales can make people. And so people need to be aware there is no lobby for sunlight. There is no lobby for natural exposure to the elements. There is no lobby for exercise. No one is mandating gym memberships. Nobody is going house to house offering you fresh fruits and vegetables. Nobody is promoting, natural, wholesome sunlight exposure. Nobody is, offering to come in and, as a public health measure, make sure that your ducts and HVAC systems are clean. People need to wake up and realize that the institutions they've entrusted with a lot of their power and an enormous amount of their tax dollars are not adequately defending their interests from corporations. And not only corporations, but obviously the government officials, bureaucrats, et cetera, who really work for those corporations in effect. In the United States, this has been the hypocrisy of 2020 and then 2021 to me, which is that the same people telling everyone they need to go out and get a, experimental therapeutic. And the last time we rushed one of these things to market, what happened? 300 or 400 people died prematurely of Guillain-Barré syndrome who were young and healthy. So this doesn't exactly have a great historical track record. The same people telling people they need to go do that are voting every 5 years like clockwork for a farm bill that empowers the government to give millions and billions, for all I know, trillions of dollars worth of agricultural subsidies to corporations that then turn around and produce incredibly cheap, toxic food that the poorest and most impoverished and vulnerable members of our society then buy with food stamps that are part of the same legislation that made the food cheap in the first place. The logical conclusion of this is that the number 1 and 2 purchases of food stamps in the United States are junk food and soda. And of course, if you look at the risk factors for death by anything in this country, in the world, it's consumption of processed food is the top of the list. We talked about the importance of light, sunlight. I mean, the irony about that, right, is that these are all confounded by one another. The people who go out and spend time in nature tend to eat healthier food. The people who are sitting at home in front of the television tend to eat a lot of cheap processed food. So it's the same people doing the same things, getting the same outcomes. All of this is preventable. All of this could be stopped. None of this requires people to give up their individual liberty. And that's really, I think, been catastrophic for people's mental health. And it's also forced people into these really bizarre propaganda machines that are the mainstream media, and then the social media that really is feeding people into the mainstream media now. The mainstream media at this point is truly just propaganda. The amount of gaslighting and misinformation and, preferential treatment, double standards is just unbelievable. It's truly not, there's hardly a shred of integrity left. And I don't say that in a partisan sense, because it's really been an equal opportunity crime.
Leland, you've articulated that so beautifully, and I know your message is one of personal empowerment, empowering people to take control of their own health, which is our brief on this podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been terrific to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to tell people what's really going on.
Well, I normally, as regular listeners would know, would ask my guest what they think the biggest challenge was for us on our health journey. But gee, the way Leland articulated that at the end of our interview, when I just asked him about COVID, nailed it completely. I mean, covered all the bases. And it is really the message of this podcast. It's the message of this book. And that is to understand how public health messages are conflicted. And they are not with the best of public health in mind. And I think one of my disappointments about this COVID, the way we've approached COVID, is we have an opportunity. If our focus was truly on public health, then yes, we would be developing all the pharmaceutical interventions to deal with the disease at its worst, and we would look at trying to develop a vaccine to eliminate it. And hey, vaccines normally take 4 to 5 years to develop. Obviously, we've got a lot of resources here, but at the same time, we would be promoting and encouraging things which improve immune function, because that immune function has never been more important. Because with a healthy immune system, you avoid the comorbidities which make you more susceptible to the complications of the disease, of which death is the worst complication. So this is, it was interesting to hear Leland talk about that. And when I was introduced to Leland, and I've often said to my listeners, please send me your suggestions about who you think we should listen to. And this is a shout out to 2 of my listeners. Thank you, Ian and Fern Hood, for the suggestions. And I actually, that's how I came to find Leland. And I was attracted to his story because for a practitioner relatively early on in his journey, it's actually a very interesting story before he entered med school, his journey through med school with a very open mind, and who he has been mentored by since he set up his own practice and how he's approaching things. And he articulates things so well, and we'll have links to his website in the show notes, so please follow that through. Now listen, don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes. There's the commercial, and here's another commercial, that Unstressed with Dr. Ron Ehrlich. The app is also downloadable, and that will keep you in touch with the exciting programs that we have planned for the second half of this year. So I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.